Hello and salutations to you all once again. Welcome back to the Philos-Hippie, where we explore the intersection of spirituality and philosophy and how we can lead more holistic and meaningful secular lives. Now, to begin today's episode, I just want to point out and say that it is an extremely challenging time for anyone to be who labels themselves as spiritual but not religious today. Churches are rapidly dying due to tribalistic beliefs that exclude anyone that doesn't adhere to its universal creed. The institutions people used to go to find their part in the greater whole are quickly dissipating, if already non existent. The commodification of spiritual practices through New Ageism or the new McMindfulness movement are quite shallow, and they do not provide deep spiritual fulfillment and meaning to people's lives, but they rather serve as cheap relaxation techniques or methods to cope with the alienating nature of late stage capitalism. This has put all the burden of spiritual development solely on the individual. But how in the hell does anyone have the intellectual resources, time, and energy and knowledge to navigate this ever changing landscape? The result is a messy, incoherent jarble of loosely connected ideas that sound truthful when arranged together in the right way, but lack any real substance and depth. Being spiritual in the 21st century feels equally confusing, absurd, and challenging in order to get a grasp of reality. I would know because that is what's personally been like for me. After deconstructing Christianity during my teen years, foregoing my dreams of going into seminary to serve others and to serve God, philosophy has almost become my new religion, albeit without any institutional or community support. And this has led to deep confusion in my personal life as I've tried to navigate these muddy and murky waters. For example, the philosophies of Stoicism, Buddhism, and existentialism all deeply appeal to me in unique ways, but they have different interpretations on how one can live an ethical life. Stoics, for instance, prioritize self discipline and accepting fate, but existentialists argue that one is radically free to create their own purpose, not being tied to fate. Meanwhile, Buddhists claim that we should not even have a purpose linked to the perpetuation of the self or ego or mind. Is it better to cultivate character for the self, or should one dissolve their sense of self in order to serve others? Surely living an ethical life is not the only sufficient, albeit it is necessary, requirement to live a deeply spiritual but not religious life. But what role does art and creativity and music and dance play in all of these philosophies? What about serving others and making the world a better place in the political realm and activism? What about the mundane aspects of everyday life? Surely a holistic life would not ignore these potential avenues for spiritual fulfillment as well. You see, I have centered most of my life around answering these questions, for I've always been a spiritual seeker deep down inside, oftentimes without even recognizing it, and I feel the same way for you most likely. But it feels as though I've been trudging through a neon lit spiritual marketplace today that's constantly hammering for my attention, which leads to overwhelming spiritual confusion and disorientation. Now, in this first official episode of the podcast, I hope to accomplish the task of disambiguating what it means to be spiritual but not religious, and how one can begin to learn how to confidently and authentically live life in deep ambiguity and uncertainty, while at the same time growing in self confidence and groundedness in the values one adheres to in their life. Something which I believe is sorely lacking in our nihilistic culture today. As we will come to see, this involves defining one's ideals and values for themselves while standing confidently firm in them as the tides of chaos roll over us all. Now, the root of all spiritual practice, as we will start to see, is fundamentally a return to inner experience and self knowledge, a process not favored by organized religions. Now, of course, I do not have all the answers, and I'm not acting like I do, because I am no prophet nor saint. I am only a fellow passenger on this journey of life, and I'm learning right alongside with you. And that process may be bumpy and confusing, but all I can offer is my own unique perspective and experience. But really, I hope that we can explore this topic together and expand our minds on what it means to be spiritual but not religious. or SBNR in short, as I'll later reference, and how to live that kind of life with genuine authenticity. I'm not saying I have any answers, but maybe we can try to make just a little more sense of this chaotic world together, and in the process, give some meaning back to the universe. Now, to begin with, we need to commit the overdone philosophical sin of trying to provide definitions to a subject that we will ultimately never have a clear answer to. But we can sure as hell try and use our rationality to make a bridge to the divine and immanent in our lives. In the beginning of our discussion of what it means to be spiritual but not religious, or SBNR for short, we need to understand the nuanced differences between the words spiritual and religious. It may appear simple at first, but when you start digging into this concept, things immediately begin to get fuzzy. For example, why are people labeled spiritual but not religious, instead of religious but not spiritual? Can a person even be religious but not spiritual? Are the two inseparably related, or are they their own unique concepts? Perhaps it's best then to begin our discussion with defining spirituality, and then proceed to figure out what being religious exactly means. For me, I think the etymological definition is a great place to start in order to get a sense of how spirituality differs from religion. According to renowned poet Jane Hersfield, the root of spirit is the Latin spirare, to breathe. Whatever lives on the breath then must have its spiritual dimension. End quote. This is where we get words like respiration, spirit, and inspire. Breath has always been viewed as inherently connected to spirit. However, this is not found only in cultures with Latin roots. In fact, the spiritual breath of life is synonymous with many ancient cultures' perspective on spirit or the life essence that breathes life into us all. Nearly all ancient cultures define their perspectives of spirit or soul or life essence with the breath. The ancient word for the ancient Hebrew word for spirit is ruach, and simply means breath or air, and was used to mean that God's breath was in our lungs. The ancient Greek's word for breath was pneuma, and was also derived from the verb neo, which meant to breathe. The early Christians later adapted the same word pneuma to mean the Holy Spirit. What is amazing is that this conception of breath as spirit is similarly found in Eastern cultures. Most notably, the Sanskrit word prana is translated as breath of life and comes from the root pra, meaning to breathe, and the whole practice of yoga called pranayama, which aims to clear blocked pathways so our prana, our energy, can be released and flow once again. I like to personally visualize this as a flutist trying to clean the inside of their flute so that the sound is not distorted by all the dirt and grime and saliva that builds up over time, allowing the flute to play beautifully when its pathways are fully cleared. The same idea of clearing pathways for life energy to flow out of oneself is also found within ancient Chinese traditions like Taoism. Their definition of life force is qi, and its Chinese character is, as you see right there. Now, this Chinese character is fascinating because it combines two characters, steam, breath, or air, and rising from rice as it cooks. The reason why air is connected with rice as it cooks in Chinese is because they understood the nourishing, life sustaining role that the breath plays in our life. Even in indigenous traditions found in the Americas, a common theme is manifested within the Great Spirit, who is the divine essence that permeates all existence and gives us life through the breath. So, maybe what it means to be spiritual but not religious has to do with a continual remembrance of the breath or essence that gives you life, an experience ultimately rooted in our inner selves. No matter what creed one belongs to, every single person on the planet can find solace through their breath and view it as a life giving force. So, maybe spirituality, at its core, is simply an internal return towards that which produces life giving energy. Doesn't that simplify things a whole lot? However, I think we can dive a little deeper. In its essence, spirituality is about one's personal experience to their breath, or how or spirit, and how they internally relate to it. So then, how does one go about life tied to spirituality? Obviously, all the religions of the world will have vastly different takes on this, but we can still find some common elements amongst the midst of them. Although the breath is an integral aspect of spirituality, that is not all that comprises the spiritual life. According to James Carey, a philosopher of religion, there are four central aspects to spirituality. It is 1, an ethically directed; 2, way of life; 3, with a particular focus on inner transformation; 4, taken in the light of what is taken to be ultimate. Let's now dive a little more as to what this means exactly. You see, the first two aspects are closely related. Living a spiritual life has a notably ethical bent towards it, because the spiritual person is one who thinks that there are right and wrong ways to live and has a basic commitment to live in the right way, according to Carey. This is not to say that there is only one objectively good way to live, but rather the path to eudaimonia or enlightenment or whatever you call it is pluralistic. It does not matter where the winds of ethics blow our sails, as long as it sails us forward. When one develops an ethically based worldview, they then put it into practice in the real world and let its principles guide their actions and way of being in the world. To quote Carey, for the spiritual person, the ethical commitment is a driving force in life, something seen as requiring constant work and watchfulness. And this is in part because for them, the primary ethical question is not about the rightness and wrongness of actions, although this is important, but about how to be a virtuous person and how to live the best kind of life. The spiritual sage does not care about being a goody two shoes that gloats about their supposedly good deeds like we see in many evangelical churches today. Rather, they care more about living their lives in a way that abides with their ethical conscience and that it has a tangible impact on ourselves, others, and the world in which we live. Living ethically is fundamentally intertwined with living a specific way of life, and if the two are not harmonious, then the fruits we are sowing will be rotten and done in vain. Pierre Hadot famously claimed that the way ancient Greeks did philosophy was ultimately a way of life, not too dissimilar from the religious peers devoted to the Greek pantheon. Now, the third central aspect of spirituality is character cultivation, because it requires the individual to constantly direct their focus on inner transformation. This inward turn typically involves examining the mechanisms of the mind and realizing its role for filtering our experience of reality. And it is only by gaining control over our conscious awareness that we are able to lead ethical and flourishing lives. Now, all spiritual traditions recognize that the faculties of the mind are simultaneously adaptive and maladaptive. Our perception is a powerful tool for cutting through millions and millions of bits of sensory information that are entering our brains every minute. And because of that, we have to narrow our focus in order to make sense of everything. However, the way in which we harness our attention can be used for good or for ill. Our inner lives directly influence the quality of our experiential existence and are one of the only things we have complete control over in the world. The famous adage from the Stoic Epictetus rings true when he said that we cannot control this world, but we can control how we react to it. This is where the breath comes in again, because typically, the breath has been used as the access point in all traditions for inner transformation. This is because the breath is one of the most unique physiological processes our bodies are constantly in. The breath is one of the only functions of the body that is simultaneously voluntary and involuntary. We cannot not breathe because then we will suffocate and die. But once we turn our awareness to the breath, we are then able to control it with conscious intention, allowing ourselves to calm ourselves or hype ourselves up, depending on the circumstance. Once people realize that the breath is the remote control of our nervous system and minds, we are truly capable of deep transformative change. Now, of course, we must also have a general framework of the world, and how we view it will directly impact the way in which we lead our ethical lives. Spiritual people will try to see the world as it is and will change the way they live in order to live an ethical life in the light of the real, according to Carey. Like Paul being blinded on the road to Damascus, we see the light of glory and orient every aspect of our lives towards that shining radiance. In most spiritual traditions, what is taken to be ultimate or transcendent will be a personal deity like Yahweh or Jesus or some harmonic and cosmic force like the Tao in the East or Logos and more mystical branches in the West. In New Age spirituality, it's typically just seen as a all-pervading general life force. The ultimate may not even involve any metaphysical aspects. It may be purely material. This is how the ancient Epicureans, Aristotle, Nietzsche, and modern figures like Carl Sagan found awe in the universe without a god. They find spiritual fulfillment in the immanent nature of reality without appeal to a higher force. Now, the common pin behind all of these frameworks is that its spirituality is not solely focused on the narcissistic individual and personal self growth, but that it also necessarily involves one to look outside oneself and view themselves as part of a greater whole in reality, and that they have a role to play in that scheme. We cannot expect to find spiritual fulfillment if we live in our heads alone in a realm of sinister solipsism. It is when we begin to explore ethical frameworks of the world that spirituality can begin to blend with religious doctrine, but does not necessarily have to be. To sum up briefly, at its basic, spirituality involves some kind of higher order view about the good life and living that life authentically aligned to our beliefs, which involves an inner return to experience and the basic facts necessary to transform human psychology and to reorient itself in a larger scheme of reality with a coherent worldview. It does not have to evolve any more than that, but if it does, it can lead the ground for dogmatic religion and irresolvable truth claims, which inevitably leads us to our next question. What does religion mean, and how exactly is it related to spirituality? Now, the major institutionalized religions of the world, the Abrahamic religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and more, all include four central aspects in my eyes: doctrine, dogma, cult, and spirituality. All spiritual practices necessarily involve some kind of doctrine in order to orient their lives. However, doctrine is not exclusively religious. The word doctrine comes from the Latin doctrina, which simply means teaching or instruction. In this context, doctrine is simply a certain group of established principles and guidelines in a specific field like law or medicine or even in military. In religious context, doctrine becomes an officially accepted set of beliefs that all adherents of the faith are required to confess as divinely true, that it then transforms itself into dogma. Dogma and doctrine are not the same. Dogma is a specific type of doctrine that is codified into absolute divine law. Dogma is prevalent in groups when they forbid any kind of outside perspective that can possibly weaken the truth claims they declare to be completely infallible and incapable of being wrong. It is when a large group of believers share the same dogmatic values and profess it as true that a group then turns itself into a cult. In fact, this is where the word religion originated from. In Latin, the word religion was derived from the Latin word religare or religio, which means to tie or to bind. People would bind themselves together to a community that shared the same dogmatic creeds, like the Nicene Creed, for example. A cult always involves a communal ritual dedicated to devotion of a particular deity or object or collective set of established dogma. The public perception of religion is that people typically view it as belief that is linked to institutionalized, ritualized, creedal expressions of faith. What makes spirituality bleed into religion is that both use doctrine to guide an individual to inner transformation. However, what appears to be the biggest difference between spirituality and religion is the contextual setting in which the practices take place. For example, spirituality is primarily individualized, while religion is a primarily communal experience. Spirituality is about one's personal encounter with the transcendent, while religion requires one to conform to a cult's doctrine and their experience of the immanent or transcendent is mediated through their priests or religious leaders. So, the main difference between philosophies as a way of life, like Zen Buddhism, Stoicism, existentialism, and then the great religions such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is that the former can be identified as being spiritual but not religious, because there are no dogmatic and cultish elements involved, even though there are elements of doctrine and spirituality. Of course, this all may be a bit of an overgeneralization, but that's what philosophy is for, anyways, right? But, however, it does help provide some insight as to what spirituality and religion tend to emphasize respectively. Each religion emphasizes these four aspects differently. Buddhism, for example, if you call it a religion, I know there's a big debate over that. Buddhism places more emphasis on personal cultivation of spirituality, while Catholicism emphasizes the cultish aspects and intermediary through the priest. This can give us further clarity on how to live a spiritual but not religious lifestyle. So this leads us to the question, what are the semantic origins of SBNR, and where did it come from? Nowadays, religion is declining in the United States, despite the trend among Gen Z like myself saying that they are turning back to religion. But I think this is mostly not out of an attempt to connect with the divine, but rather as a way to cope with the throes of nihilism rampant in our community lacking culture. Now, almost three-fifths of the population still label themselves as religious. Another fifth of the population is mostly atheist, but the other fifth of the population, roughly 70 million people, identify as spiritual but not religious. What is most surprising, however, is that nearly 90% of all people who identify as SBNR came from mainstream Christianity, myself included. According to recent Pew Research data, SBNRs are less likely than religious adults to believe in God as described in the Bible, 20 versus 82%. They don't pray as daily, 21 versus 64%, and they don't attend religious services at least once a week, 2 versus 36%. They are more likely to be democratic leaning and also more likely to believe that spiritual energies reside in non human animals and in nature. The term was first introduced in academic circles in the 1960s, but it became popularized in the new millennium, right as online dating which took off, which made it a lot easier for people to label themselves and to make oneself not look like a moralistic or cynical asshole on their dating profiles if they label themselves as atheist. A broader trend of SBNR reflects a greater emphasis towards individualism and skepticism towards institutions. Although SBNR is a new term that wasn't mainstream until the new millennium, the psychedelic and hippie revolution of the 60s paved the way for a cultural shift towards alternative spiritualities. As people started to expand their minds with psychedelics and Eastern philosophy in the 1960s and 70s, they also opened their souls to new spiritual practices found in the East, while completely abandoning the organized religious institutions that they were brought up in and raised in. Naturally, rebellious youth began to question the purist and traditionalist doctrine their parents had been preaching to them since the 50s and even way before that. And they looked elsewhere to fill the emptiness in their lives that God had once filled in their hearts. According to James Carey, once again, the new spiritual but not religious movement is not primarily an attempt to invent something entirely novel, but rather a striving after a quality of life and experience already glimpsed within those traditions without what is seen as excess baggage. What exactly is this quality of experience that is lacking in religions today, which can cause people to completely discard their religious communities in order to seek something deeper? Now, today, many people opt out, or many people opt to be spiritual rather than religious because many do not like the strict dogma that external religious communities impose on its adherents, or how fanatically political some groups have become. Due to the cultish nature of religion, it requires believers to conform to the community's teachings, and this can inevitably clash with individuals' belief systems if they feel that the church's teachings conflict with their own personal values. Organized religions tend to de emphasize the role self discovery plays in what the individual will believe or not believe, and they will shun or dispel their personal doubts and ideas if it does not align with the greater whole and the greater theology. People who claim to be spiritual but not religious have typically become disillusioned with institutionalized religions. However, they still have that lingering taste for the transcendent and still have and they're still in contact with their spirituality, and they continue to yearn for profound spiritual experiences and meaning in their lives still. However, they may differ with church's teachings on many subjects. They still find that some teachings in those traditions contain some deep wisdom about the human condition, like the parables of Jesus, for example, and find that even his teachings 2,000 years ago are still relevant even today. Much of this ancient deep wisdom that SBNRs are striving to come back to is an internal return to felt, lived experience, while distancing themselves away from abstract conceptualizations of God. This is a big reason why contemplative prayer, a kind of meditative prayer, is rarely talked about in evangelical groups today, even though it's very popular in Eastern branches, and due to its connotations as being viewed as demonic among the evangelical community. In fact, contemplative prayer is seen as an opposition to biblical Christianity and should definitely be avoided because contemplative prayer is mostly a subjective experience evangelicals think that, quote, trusting in experiential knowledge over the biblical record takes a person outside of the standard that is the Bible, according to the infamous God Questions website, which strives to eliminate any wonder, curiosity, and doubt about living the Christian life in the digital era that I used to be quite a fan of. According to Richard Rohr, a modern day Christian mystic, contemplative prayer is the way we work out the experiences that words elude, how we learn from them and bravely allow ourselves to be transformed by them, even when our normal modes of thinking can't sense them. End quote. The practice is typically rooted on the breath and on a centering prayer, where one stills the mind and observes to let go of all their thoughts without judgment and aim all their attention at God in order to attain a mystical union with them, as described by medieval mystics like Meister Eckhart and Hildegard of Bingen. Now, this union or oneness with God is when we realize that we are not separate selves detached from God, but rather that God is always present within us. This is why Jesus said that the kingdom is already at hand. In John 14:20, for example, Jesus tells his disciples that, quote, one day you will learn and realize that I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I am in you. Later on in the New Testament, Paul would succinctly describe in Galatians 2:20, where he says, quote, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. End quote. Here it appears that Jesus and Paul are talking about the dissolution of the ego and the interconnectedness of all things binding together through God or logos or divine deity. It is a complete rejection of the ideas discussed above that's causing people to leave churches in droves. Organized religions are afraid of the role subjective, felt experience plays in people's spiritual lives because it completely changes the power dynamics within religion. A pastor can no longer claim spiritual authority over you if you find that within you is the ultimate spiritual authority, God. If you do not believe in eternal hellfire, it is a lot harder for a priest to get you to obey the commandments. It is their insistence that their worldview is inherently objective and that anything that departs from their worldview, is immediately seen as demonic that makes people question their values, fundamental beliefs, and even identities, and causes people to keep spirituality seeking outside of religion, outside of organizations. Obviously, people choose not to stay in their outdated religions for many reasons. But what is it that makes people make that scary leap from atheism to some belief outside themselves still? Why wouldn't someone choose to believe in Pascal's wager that basically argues that people should believe in God, not out of love or worship, but simply out of fear, because it is the best way to avoid infinite loss in hell? I think this inevitably reduces God to uh, reductionistic fire insurance. What makes people stay religious with conflicting beliefs? And what is it that makes them make the leap out of uncertainty and into uncertainty? For me, it was because I was not really brave enough yet to face the deep abyss of existential uncertainty that rested behind my God shaped hole in my heart. When I left Christianity, I was deeply afraid because I was super happy as a Christian. I felt deeply connected and involved with my church, viewing them as a second family almost, if not my prime. Everything I did was infused with meaning and purpose because I tried to do all I did in the name and service of God, which produced a lot of endless joy in me. In the last stages of my church attendance, I foolishly believed that I wouldn't be as fulfilled as I was if I left my community, which was a valid concern. I was hopelessly holding on to any kernels of faith I still held in my heart, even though they mostly were just faint embers by that point. I thought that if I stopped thinking about these issues and devoted myself completely to service, then I wouldn't have these issues of doubt anymore. But I was fatally wrong because I was living in bad faith, according to John Paul Sartre. He defines bad faith as a form of self deception where individuals deny their own freedom and responsibility, essentially pretending to be something they are not, or refusing to acknowledge the possibilities available to them. End quote. After a while, the contradictions and inconsistencies piled up such a massive amount of evidence that I couldn't turn away from it anymore without being dishonest with myself. The incongruence with my inner emotions and beliefs kept conflicting with what I saw in church, and it eventually forced me to take the leap into the unknown. I was terrified because I thought my life would become existentially flat, and I questioned my capacity to reproduce that sense of well being, purpose, and meaning I had only experienced within the church. And to be completely honest, for a long time, I wasn't able to return to that level of happiness and fulfillment because I was still spiritually lost and directionless. I stopped seeking together altogether for a long time and lived atheistically and lived my life without any concern for any spirituality. While it was simultaneously empowering and liberating, it still felt hollow and empty to me inside. I felt like I was still lacking something crucial. My life had indeed become existentially flat. This is all that life has to offer now? I knew deep in my soul that was not the case because I had experienced profound moments of intimacy and connection when I was religious, and just because I didn't believe in God anymore didn't make those experiences any less meaningful and powerful for me. I began my spiritual quest outside of God, trying to ask the question, is one still able to live an equally fulfilling and meaningful life without being religious? How can one still be secularly spiritual without becoming superficial? I was determined to find all that life has to offer in its myriad manifestations. However, studies often show that religious people often report higher levels of happiness, life satisfaction, and subjective well being. But this does not mean that one cannot reproduce that while living a secular, non religious life. And that's what this channel and my determined effort is here to prove to the world. A 2014 Pew study found that non religious people who still engage in self reflection and contribute to their communities still report high levels of satisfaction in their lives. They are still able to experience existential gratitude, appreciation for existence without religious belief, allowing people to feel the same profound feelings of awe and purpose which they once felt in religion. Speaking anecdotally, non religious people tend to have more psychological resilience because they have created their own meaningful frameworks for coping and dealing with the harshness of the world, thereby strengthening one's confidence in self in their life. However, if one is not ready to engage in one's personal transvaluation of all values and create their own systems of meaning, like Friedrich Nietzsche talked about, there are already a plethora of philosophies available with blueprints readily available where one can begin their spiritual journey outside of religion. So, this now leads us to ask ourselves, what then are some examples of traditions or philosophies or practices that can be spiritual but not religious, which can also still lead to deeper, fulfilling experiences? I plan on doing a deep dive into all of these traditions someday, but for the sake of brevity today, I would like to just discuss two traditions that stand out to me, one being ancient and one being contemporary. I will show how they fit the four essential criteria for spiritual but not religious. And to recall from James Carey earlier, just to reiterate, These four criteria are 1, an ethically directed, 2, way of life, 3, with a particular focus on inner transformation, 4, taken in the light of what is to be ultimate. The first philosophy is Epicureanism, and it's an interesting ancient philosophy because it provides a naturalistic and rational framework for being spiritual, unlike the Abrahamic religions, which is completely focused and centered around faith. It is an ethically oriented way of life that is concerned with the simple things in life, where all ethical conduct is aimed at achieving a state of ataraxia, a Greek term that means a peace of mind unperturbed by external circumstances. It is similar to Aristotle's notion of eudaimonia, but this is almost like the Western Buddhist version of that concept in my eyes. Achieving ataraxia was done through cultivating virtues like friendship and moderation, with the purpose of transforming one's mindset to eliminate irrational fears like death and its desires in order to experience the ultimate, which for the Epicureans was not supernatural, but simply the natural pursuit of simple pleasures and the avoidance of pain, which was all grounded in naturalistic understanding of the world. Existentialism is the next philosophy, and it's atheistic like Epicureanism, but offers a different philosophical take and system to navigate reality. Existentialism is an ethically oriented way of life which is concerned with living authentically in accordance with one's personal freedom. This could be argued to be ethically oriented, even though there is no objective sense of right or wrong within the existentialist lens, because authentic existence is more closely related to the nature of reality than living in bad faith or self deception. Living authentically is living ethically. Existentialists focus on inner transformation as well, but through the process of self overcoming existential dread. While there is no guiding ultimate to orient one's life around, the ultimate could be viewed as a personal confrontation with the absurd, which is not metaphysically grounded, but existentially felt, and the values one creates in response to that are personally viewed as the ultimate. One constructs their own ultimate in absurdism, for example, and what makes existentialism so empowering. Albert Camus' rebelling against the absurd is an excellent example of how to have a guiding ultimate in one's life, while simultaneously living in a world devoid of complete meaning. These philosophies serve as a way of life that is free from the constraints of religion. But this leads us to ask now, what exactly is a philosophy as a way of life? I've used that phrase repeatedly in this episode without fully explaining why. So, what exactly does it mean? Is it any deeper than the dude's way of life in the Big Lebowski with dudism? The answer to that is an astounding yes, because it is crucial to understand what philosophy used to mean in ancient times. And I talked about this in the last video a little bit, but I'll dive deeper now. In ancient Athens, philosophy was not only a cultural and intellectual revolution, it was also a spiritual revolution. Similar to the 60s and 70s when alternative spiritualities were introduced to the West, in ancient Athens, philosophy became the dominant cultural current that found wisdom in the traditions of religion and functioned similarly to it. But it made itself distinct in its methodologies and in its application of wisdom. Ancient philosophers still engaged in religious ideas like what is the nature of the cosmos, or how should one live, and what happens after death. But they would frequently challenge their traditional religions at the time because they prioritized reason above blind ritual and focused more on individual ethical development rather than by abiding in communal participation and conformity that attempted to appease the ancient Greek pantheon, which was also seen as too anthropomorphic for philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. The key difference between ancient and modern philosophy was that philosophy was not some abstract discipline which attempted to examine the nature of reality from the comfort of leather backed armchairs, which is so prevalent today, but rather they saw philosophy as a way of life, according to Pierre Hadot. Philosophy, according to him, was rooted in ascesis, a Greek term meaning training or discipline, and was ultimately a framework for living according to wisdom, and one trained in this wisdom with spiritual exercises. Now, this will be another whole topic eventually, but for now, spiritual exercises are a compilation of meditations, prayers, and contemplative practices that were aimed at transforming the self through the process of metanoia, which is a Greek word meaning a change of mind or heart. These spiritual exercises included meditations on death and mortality, contemplating one's place within the cosmos, and it also included mental visualizations that would train one to live according to reason, thereby leading to self mastery or complete knowledge of the self. Philosophy always served as the backdrop for these spiritual exercises because it provided a general framework of reality that infused these practices with meaning, coherence, and depth, thereby showing that philosophy and spirituality were always deeply intertwined with each other. Of course, many modern philosophers would scorn at the idea that philosophy and spirituality are inherently connected, but I would have to disagree with them. Although one can engage in philosophy without being spiritual, which is perfectly fine and in fact needed if we want an objective, holistic view of reality, I do not think it is possible to be spiritual without being simultaneously philosophical. Philosophy and spirituality are deeply related to each other, and I feel that the former is crucial for development in the latter. Now, I personally do not favor the label spiritual but not religious because of its vagueness and confusion. It is vague because it is simply a negator of religion, not offering anything new to construct one's spirituality off of. I surmise that it would not be too far out of left field to suggest that perhaps we can discard this label altogether for something more affirmative and positive. That label, in my eyes, would be SAP, spiritual and philosophical, not spiritual but not religious. The reason why I suggest people affirm the philosophical side is because if spiritual practice is primarily located at the individual level, then no other intellectual tradition addresses the quest for self knowledge and transformation more passionately than philosophy, not religion. As discussed earlier, there is a difference between spirituality and religion that deal with their instructed teachings and interpretation of doctrine. Religious commandments tend to become dogmatic in order to promote unity within a culture's community. But when people abandon their organized religions and seek spirituality for themselves, they become fundamentally philosophical in their quest to know thyself. All spiritual practices, at its core, are a quest for self knowledge in my eyes, and philosophy serves as a kind of roadmap for how to get there. Now, to wrap things up and conclude, despite its potential for sappiness with the label SAP, I feel that the label spiritual and philosophical is a better alternative to the label spiritual but not religious SBNR, and I hope that it becomes more commonly used someday. Many spiritual seekers today, like myself, find themselves existing in hopeless conditions at the state of the world we live in, and for the personal flourishing of their soul. A lot of this is due to the slow death of organized religions and lack of community, and in its absence, people have been living in a swirling vortex of conflicting values and are spiritually lost. We continually try to latch on to something to steady ourselves in the chaos, but we are never able to fully grasp anything. The shadow of nihilism lingers behind us as we walk through the neon lit spiritual marketplace of the 21st century. We are constantly being advertised new cures for the soul that promise us inner peace, but for a price. We pay the price when we think that money can buy us that. This is why using philosophy as a way of life is crucial to anyone seeking greater spiritual depth in their lives, and simultaneously trying to distance themselves from their traumatic religious upbringing, like myself. Philosophy can help provide guidance through rationality and reason while showing us where we should direct our precious time and attention. Philosophy is the main method people use across the world for staying connected to their spiritual roots while distancing themselves from the controlling grip of religious institutions. Philosophy as a way of life, it allows people to be authentically spiritual but not religious while staying true to their authentic beliefs and values. And hopefully, the label spiritual and philosophical will catch on in order to help people find greater clarity and direction in their lives, while not succumbing to the skila of organized religion and sinking beneath the nihilistic whirlpools of Carbitis from the Odyssey, for example. Now, thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast today, the very first episode. How exciting! And I hope you join me next time as we dive deeper into the philosophy of flow and how it can provide a valuable blueprint for living more fulfilled and eudaimonic lives. Thanks for watching, and peace!